All right, let's get going here. This hearing will come to order. Let me welcome everyone. This is a bit of an unusual day in that we have the 9/11 Pentagon Memorial Service going on right now. And I understand at 3 o'clock last night they closed that interstate down over there. So we have, I'm sure, lots of staff and friends that were members that were taking alternate routes. Will take a little bit longer. And but I know that we have a variety of staff and members also that are watching this hearing on TV, and so we want to proceed. Before we get going today, I want to take care of a few housekeeping details, since this will be our last full committee hearing for the session. As you may know, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the Science and Technology Committee. In honor of that milestone, we have collaborated with the House Historian's Office to produce a history of the committee, and it is on our various desks, and we'll be getting around to our different stakeholders and friends soon. The Historian's Office has been working to standardize the format to best help future researchers and historians, and our history will be the model for the committees going forward, and so we have provided these copies today. Secondly, since many members have expressed interest in attending a shuttle launch, I want to let you know that the next launch is currently scheduled for Friday, October the 10th at 12:30 a.m., so coffee will be provided. There is a possibility that Mr. Monahan at the Appropriations Committee will be taking a CODEL for that launch, and that our members have been asked to join, and if not, if we have enough members, we will put together a CODEL of our own. There's also a launch that's currently scheduled for November the 12th that might be a better option for some members. Third, I would like to again congratulate all the members of the committee for the good and constructive work that we've done this year in a very bipartisan way. Today marks the 122nd hearing, and I'm sure that we hear groans going up from the staff because of that, but we've had 122 hearings. We have moved 78 bills and resolutions through the House, 24 of which have become law, and we have several more pending in the Senate that we hope that will become law before the session's over. This is a record that we should all be proud of, and I hope that we can do even better next year. And I'm also very pleased that all those bills and resolutions came out of this committee on a bipartisan basis. We're in the process now of trying to close the books on this year. We will soon start to look at our agenda for next year, and we want to do it in a collaborative way. We find that if you take good ideas and work together with Democrats and Republicans to build a coalition, that you get a much better bill, and we're going to continue that. Also, for members' attention, I'll let you know that we postponed a trip or a CODEL to look at some of the nuclear reprocessing that is done in France, and that we will try to get that back up again in the spring. And so that's where, I guess the final point I should make is that our committee volunteered to be the model for the new energy efficient rooms here in on the Capitol complex. We have finished many of those. As soon as our last subcommittee hearing is over with, they'll come in and finish up this hearing room, and then hopefully by maybe next January or so, we want to invite the family and friends, particularly of our staff, to come and see where they spend all their time, and to show the rest of Congress how you really can save energy with a energy efficient office. And so finally, in light of the commemorative ceremony that will be taking place on the Capitol steps later this morning, I intend to keep the hearing moving so that we have an adequate opportunity to hear from our witnesses and examine the important issues facing the NextGen program before the members have to depart for the ceremony at 11:30. I therefore will be brief in my opening remarks, and I will begin by welcoming our witnesses to today's hearing on a very important topic. America's air transportation system has long been the envy of the world, and it's an important contributor to the nation's economic vitality and the quality of life. Yet it is clear that it is a system under stress and needs to change. Congress recognized that fact when it established the Next Generation Air Traffic Transportation System Initiative, now known as NextGen, in its Vision 100 FAA reauthorization that was enacted in late 2003. We sought to harness the resources and expertise of FAA, NASA, DoD, Commerce, DHS, and OSTP in a joint effort to transform the nation's ATC system so that it will be able to handle the anticipated dramatic future increase in travel demand without compromising safety or the environment. Today's hearing will provide the committee with the opportunity to review the progress that has been made to date, as well as examine the challenges that need to be addressed. We should have no illusions about the magnitude of the task. NextGen is a systems, engineering, management, and regulatory challenge as complex as any the nation has ever faced, and success is not guaranteed. Last year, we recognized that NextGen has to succeed. Recognizing that NextGen needs to succeed, this committee and the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee worked together to frame provisions in the House FAA Reauthorization Bill, H.R. 2881, that sought to strengthen the interagency NextGen planning and development effort and to move NextGen R&D into new operational capacities as soon as practicable. In that regard, I want to salute Chairman Costello of the T&I Aviation Subcommittee for his strong leadership in developing the overall FAA reauthorization bill and for the spirit of cooperation he showed to us. In addition to his T&I responsibility, he is a valued senior member of this committee, and I look forward to continuing to work collaboratively with him and his staff on these important issues in the next Congress. Yet we also need for the FAA to work cooperatively with us if we are to fulfill our oversight responsibility with respect to the NextGen initiative. Therefore, it was troubling to find out that the restructuring of the FAA's NextGen program this summer from news accounts and not from the FAA itself. It was also very troubling to find out that the status of the NextGen Joint Planning and Development Office, JTDO, had been downgraded in the FAA in the restructuring in a move directly counter to the intent of the provisions of H.R. 2881. We need to hear why FAA decided to take such a step in the waning days of the current administration. And finally, it is troubling that the FAA did not deliver this testimony for today's hearing to the committee until yesterday afternoon at 3 o'clock, giving us little time to review it. I find that unacceptable, and I hope that we will not see a repeat of any of these practices when it comes to meetings in the 100th and 11th Congress. As my friend Mr. Hall remembers, former Chairman Sensenbrenner dismissed a hearing like this a few years ago because of late testimony. We're not going to do that this time because this is our last hearing, but this is going to be important. This committee is going to do its oversight. We can do it the easy way, or we can do it the hard way. And I hope that we're going to be able to work together next year. Well, we have a great deal of issues to cover today, so I will close by simply expressing my strong belief that the next president needs to make the NextGen initiative a national priority and ensure that it is given the resources, management attention, and sense of urgency that it warrants. It is important. Again, I want to welcome our witnesses, and I look forward to their testimony, and I now recognize Mr. Hall for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you. And before I go into my opening statement, let me agree wholeheartedly with your opening statement and your outlining the accomplishments of this committee. More than any other committee under the Capitol Dome, we've been successful, and we've been successful because we've had good leadership. And I'd say this, if all chairmen have operated like our chairman has operated, both professional leadership and personal friendship and cooperation, we'd have less acrimony and less anxiety every 2 years as to who's going to have the gavel. He's rendered a very fair gavel, extended friendship and cooperation, and I think we really ought to give him a good round of applause. So now I'll read my statement for the second time for you here. And I thank you for calling today's hearing to review the Federal Aviation Administration's development of the next generation air transportation system. I also want to extend a sincere thanks to you and to our panel of expert witnesses for taking your time from your busy schedules to appear before the committee. The information and advice you provide this committee and Congress will help us better deal with the challenges of modernizing our nation's critically important air traffic management system. Congress passed legislation not quite 5 years ago calling for the creation of the Joint Planning and Development Office and charged it with planning for and coordinating the research and development of a next-generation air transportation system. The rationale for Congress action was clear. Congestion in and around our nation's airports was reaching gridlock, resulting in significant economic losses to carriers, severely inconveniencing large numbers of passengers, and threatening the vitality of our economy. It was estimated that demand for airline services would triple by the year 2025, and absent a more comprehensive and clearly defined research, development, and implementation program, future economic growth would be jeopardized. Therefore, Congress responded by creating the JPDO to address this serious challenge. Congress clearly recognized that integrating new automated features into a nationwide network of communications, navigation, and surveillance systems is a huge challenge, and it'll take clear and persistent management to achieve NextGen's goals. We also recognize that the future system must allow for more efficient routings and minimize delays in order to conserve fuel, the cost of which has risen dramatically in the last several months. Congress was confident then, as we are today, that through the focused leadership of the Federal Aviation Administration, the JPDO, its federal partners and industry, these challenges will be met. This is the second oversight hearing in as many years held by this committee regarding NextGen. I also note that during the first session of this Congress, our committee produced legislation strengthening the role and visibility of the Joint Planning and Development Office. Sadly, the legislation has been hung up in the Senate. The nation's air traffic management system is fundamental to our economy and our quality of life. NextGen absolutely has to be allowed, must not be allowed to falter, and it's vitally important that there is accountability both at the FAA and among federal partners, and that roles and responsibilities are clearly articulated. So long as there's clarity in the management of NextGen and a well-understood and sustainable research, development, and implementation program, I'm confident that we'll succeed. And Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and again, my thanks to the witness. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statement will be added to the record. And at this time, I would like to introduce our panel of witnesses today. First, we have Ms. Victoria Cox, the Senior Vice President for NextGen and Operations Planning in the Air Traffic Organization of the Federal Aviation or the Federal Aviation Administration. Dr. Gerald Dillingham, who is a Director of Physical Infrastructure Issues at the Government Accounting Office. The Honorable Calvin Scovel III, who is the Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Transportation. Mr. Paul Kaminski, who is the Chairman and CEO of help me with that.
Technovation.
Yes, there it is. Okay. And Dr. Ian Walsh, who is the Director of the FAA and NASA-sponsored Center of Excellence Partner and the Head of the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Welcome all. And as our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which the members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. And we will start with you, Ms. Cox.
Good morning, Chairman Gordon. Thank you. It's a pleasure to address you and Congressman Hall and members of this committee. I'm Victoria Cox, the FAA Senior Vice President for NextGen and Operations Planning. Congress has been direct in its charge to the FAA. Improve the level of safety, security, efficiency, quality, and affordability of the air transportation system, and reduce the production of noise and emissions. We're following that guidance as we develop and deploy the next generation air transportation system. NextGen will apply the same precision, automation, and access to information to aviation that already exists in other industries and in our daily lives. We can deliver it, and we intend to deliver first in the places that need it most. We're accelerating our efforts with focused deployment of NextGen precision navigation capabilities around our most congested airports. We're fostering partnerships with operators equipped to perform precision navigation procedures. These efforts are yielding big benefits and lessons learned, but the real punch comes from in the form of immediate reductions to delays, fuel use, and emissions. We're still not where we want to be, but we're making progress. One of the early successes is the Atlantic Interoperability Initiative to Reduce Emissions, or AIR. It's a research and technology development venture among the FAA, the European Commission, and industry partners. It upgrades air traffic control standards and procedures in the transatlantic flights. When you make even small changes in fuel uses on flights that are typically several hours long and cover thousands of miles, the results are dramatic. We've already seen a fuel savings of 1% in oceanic airspace. A typical oceanic flight might burn 13,000 gallons. Multiply that by the number of flights over the course of a year, and 1% is a lot of fuel saved and a lot of emissions reduced. We're planning similar demonstrations in the South Pacific. In fact, the first of 3 demonstration flights will occur tomorrow from New Zealand to San Francisco. We're using NextGen technology to make things more efficient on the ground as well. We're introducing state-of-the-art surface management tools at JFK. These are based on Airport Surface Detection Equipment Model X, or ASDX. Last summer at JFK, a plane that had been holding on a ramp for hours might not have had an option to turn back to the gate readily, because no one, not the airline and not air traffic control, had a common picture of where all other aircraft were located on the ramps and at the gates. As of last month, much needed information about aircraft location is available to airlines, controllers, and to FAA's command center in Herndon, Virginia. Surface operations are no longer a black hole at JFK. Delta Airlines is already using this capability. This JFK initiative stems from a joint FAA-NASA research and development project in Memphis with FedEx and Northwest Airlines. With this capability, Northwest has significantly improved their operations, lowered fuel consumption, and cut emissions. Progress is being made, but we know that NextGen implementation is a difficult and complex undertaking. And while it cannot be accomplished without cooperation across the entire FAA and the NextGen partner agencies, we understand that there must be a single point of accountability. To that end, the FAA established the position of Senior Vice President for NextGen and Operations Planning. In that position, I am directly responsible and accountable for all elements of NextGen and have decision authority over all matters related to NextGen integration and implementation in the FAA. The establishment of this office places the Joint Planning and Development Office, the Legacy Operations Planning Function, and the new Office of NextGen Integration and Implementation under a common reporting structure. This restructure is an indication of the changing focus of NextGen from purely planning and research to actual integration and implementation of capabilities that will transform the national airspace system. And it's also a recognition of the fact that implementation must occur in the operational environment. We're not losing sight of the future NextGen vision. Our Joint Planning and Development Office will continue to focus on long-term R&D and on cross-agency cooperation. The FAA is placing its emphasis on near-term implementation and mid-term planning over a rolling 10-year time frame. Given the impact of aviation on the U.S. economy and the long-standing support from this committee, this Congress, and most of the aviation community, I sincerely believe that the impetus for NextGen and its program focus will continue and not suffer as transitions occur. In closing, I want to thank both this administration and this Congress for supporting the FAA's NextGen budget request. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my testimony, and I would be happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Costello, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the findings of the study that we undertook at your request and respond to your questions about NextGen planning, research, and development activities. I will also identify some challenges that I believe must be overcome to implement NextGen. The stakeholders I refer to in my statement are the 25 aviation industry representatives we interviewed for our study before the ATO was reorganized this past June. They include avionics, aircraft, and ATC equipment manufacturers, ATC system users, and ATC system operators. I want to note that in contrast to last year, when we testified before this committee, active air traffic controllers are now beginning to be participants in the NextGen activities. However, the safety technicians who will be involved in installing and maintaining NextGen systems have yet to become active stakeholders. You asked us about the status and usefulness of 3 key NextGen planning documents. A majority of the stakeholders told us that these documents were of limited usefulness. They said the documents provide high-level views of NextGen benefits, but do not include specific details or a structured plan for achieving tangible results. However, our review of the JPDO's next version of the work plan shows progress in providing this kind of information and could make it more useful for monitoring and the oversight of NextGen. You ask us about the availability of R&D for NextGen planning and implementation. We found that steps have been taken to address some of the initial concerns about the so-called R&D gap that resulted from changes in NASA's research emphasis and the expanding requirements of NextGen. As you know, the budget request for FAA has increased, which will provide the needed R&D funding for NextGen. JPDO, FAA, and NASA have also begun to move from proposing research to articulating a defined and prioritized R&D program using mechanisms such as the research transition teams. However, even if FAA's funding increases, some stakeholders question whether the agency has the R&D infrastructure, including the facilities and personnel, to adequately address NextGen's developmental research needs. Another of your questions related to JPDO's capacity to coordinate the efforts of partner agencies and act as an honest broker. Since the recent reorganization, JPDO is no longer a separate independent office within FAA and no longer reports directly to FAA's top management. Instead, JPDO is a part of ATO, reports to the Senior Vice President of NextGen, who in turn reports to the ATO Chief Operation Officer. It is still too soon to know if this governance structure will sufficiently address stakeholders' concerns about NextGen's leadership. Under an alternative governance structure that is included in the House reauthorization bill, the director of JPDO would be elevated to the associate administrator of NextGen, reporting directly to the administrator. We believe this proposal comes closer to addressing concerns raised by stakeholders than ATO's action and could result in another reorganization and governance structure with the passage of a reorganization bill. However, according to a FAA senior executive, the internal FAA stakeholders are knowledgeable about and supportive of the new governance structure. We have suggested that FAA consider focused outreach and education initiatives to ensure that external stakeholders also buy in and support the reorganization and new governance structure. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, in closing, I'd like to briefly turn to what I consider the other key challenges to NextGen implementation. First, to fully realize NextGen capabilities, a new configuration of ATC infrastructure will be needed. This means that FAA needs to give priority to developing a comprehensive facility consolidation and realignment plan. In addition, airports will need to have increased capacity. NextGen technologies and procedures will enhance capacity, but additions to currently planned runway construction will be necessary to handle the expected increase in traffic. Runway construction can be a very long and contentious process. The final challenge remains for Congress. Strong congressional support will be needed to advance a facility realignment proposal that may include closing or consolidating some individual facilities to streamline the entire system. And Congress will be challenged to quickly pass a reauthorization bill for FAA, confirm an FAA administrator, and a new Secretary of Transportation. Stable leadership at the top and adequate funding are necessary for the success of NextGen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Gordon, Ranking Member Hall, and members of the committee, we appreciate the opportunity to discuss the status of FAA's efforts to develop NextGen. This is a high-risk effort involving billion-dollar investments from the government and airspace users who will be expected to equip with new avionics. Today we will address 4 points. First, FAA is at a crossroads with modernizing the national airspace system. The agency faces challenges to keep existing systems on track, maintain aging facilities, and develop and implement NextGen initiatives. As we reported in April, 30 existing projects form platforms for NextGen, and over 20 critical decisions need to be made over the next 2 years that have enormous budgetary implications. To help bridge the transition from today's system to a vastly different NextGen, we recommended that FAA conduct a gap analysis of the current and NextGen systems and develop an interim architecture for the 2015 timeframe. FAA is taking steps to address our recommendations. Second, significant issues related to resource alignment, research priorities, and policy questions that will materially affect the cost and schedule for NextGen need to be addressed. A key issue focuses on NASA's work to develop advanced NextGen software for boosting controller productivity. NASA R&D is fairly well aligned with JPDO plans, but falls short with respect to validating new software and linking airport arrival and departures. We found that FAA, DoD, and DHS need to reach an agreement on NextGen security and surveillance issues. Work is also needed to reconcile differences on new weather systems, including the new 4D Weather Cube, a central database for weather observations. In addition, attention is needed to make sure human factors research for controllers and pilots is effectively linked to ensure that NextGen capabilities can be safely implemented. Third, how FAA is organized to manage and execute NextGen is an important matter. FAA's decision to place the JPDO within the ATO could help in implementing NextGen. It has the benefit of placing developmental efforts much closer to the people who will use new systems. However, it gives the appearance that JPDO has been reduced in status and importance. We think it premature to judge the change, but we found that FAA needs to clarify roles and responsibilities among offices, the JPDO and the new ATO NextGen Office for Implementation and Integration. Further, budget authority for NextGen efforts remains fragmented among FAA lines of business. How best to organize FAA is a policy call for Congress. We think FAA will have to revisit the governance of NextGen once it has a clearer picture of what it will take to deliver NextGen. Finally, a number of actions are needed from FAA going forward to help NextGen efforts from research to implementation. NextGen will be a front and center issue for the next Congress and a top management challenge for the new administration. We have made numerous recommendations to FAA aimed at reducing risk with NextGen. They focused on funding targeted human factors research and acquiring the skill sets needed to execute NextGen. At this juncture, a number of additional actions are needed, and I will highlight 5. Action item number 1, establish priorities and reflect them in budgets and plans. Decision makers do not have a clear understanding of what to invest in first. FAA should provide this committee with its priorities for NextGen R&D, how research gaps will be addressed, and how priorities will be updated as they evolve. Action item 2, develop a strategy for technology transfer. This is critical to the JPDO's mission. FAA has established transition teams for NASA work, but not for other areas. Our work shows that this needs more attention. Clearly defined exit criteria and handoff points would help transition new technologies into day-to-day use. Action item 3, focus attention on airport issues and how NextGen technologies can unlock already congested airports. This should be a top priority, and an important metric for NextGen must be to the extent to which FAA can improve airport arrival rates under all weather conditions. FAA recognizes the importance and is shifting resources to this issue. However, much work remains, and stakeholders need to know how NextGen elements, new satellite-based systems, new automation, data link communications, can boost airport capacity. Action item 4, develop a realistic plan for ADS-B, a centerpiece of NextGen. FAA has a $1.8 billion contract in place for this ground system and has published a proposed rule for the new satellite-based surveillance system. FAA plans call for users to equip with ADS-B out in the 2020 timeframe, but it's unclear when ADS-B in and the related capacity-related benefits can be realized. Concerns have been raised about requirements, the cost to equip, and the lack of clear benefits, all legitimate issues that need to be addressed. Action item 5, assess implementation bandwidth and develop transition benchmarks. FAA's ability to implement multiple capabilities in a given time period needs to be assessed. FAA and industry need realistic transition benchmarks that point to when new training for controllers and pilots, equipment, and procedures need to be in place at specific locations. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my statement. I'd be happy to answer your questions you or other members of the committee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Paul Kaminski. I'm the Chairman and CEO of Technovation Incorporated, but I'm here today representing the Aerospace Industries Association. Since January of this year, I've been representing AIA on something called the Institute Management Council, which works with the Next Generation Institute that oversees the industry participation in the JPDO. Prior to that, I had served on a senior review committee for the JPDO, having been appointed by then Secretary Mineta. I last testified before this committee in June of 2006 when I chaired the National Research Council's first decadal survey of civil aeronautics technology. In that testimony, I said that the U.S. air transportation system is a key contributor to the economic vitality, public well-being, and national security of the United States. I strongly endorse the need to improve our air transportation system then, and I believe that need is even more important today, considering issues such as the high cost of fuel and our growing concerns about the environment. NextGen, with its capacity, efficiency, energy, environmental, and safety benefits, must be a strong and urgent priority for this nation. Marion Blakey, former FAA administrator and now president of the Aerospace Industries Association, sought my assistance in the IMC in January of this year because she knew of my strong commitment to improving and actually executing on NextGen, and she also was aware of the experience I had had serving as Undersecretary of Defense dealing with the development and acquisition of very large and complex systems such as NextGen. Working with AIA, I have developed a proposal to deal with many of the issues that have been raised in previous statements and accelerate the development, acquisition, and integration of the NextGen system. This approach is based on the techniques that I used to accelerate the development and fielding of our first stealth system, the F-117, in the Department of Defense. I have found this method to be very effective in dealing with large, complex systems that depend upon the effective integration of numerous enabling technologies and complex procedures. I am prepared to address this in some more detail in a briefing with follows if there's interest or in pursuing that further, because it deals with many of the questions that you posed to me. But before getting into that detail, I'd like to highlight a few other points briefly. One, system engineering and integration is going to be critical to the success of NextGen, and that's the linchpin of the proposal that I've developed. I expect our nation's efforts on NextGen to continue for a long time as new technology enablers will continue to appear, and we must continue to consider the costs and benefits of continuing advancing technology. We must also consider the cost and benefits of maintaining legacy systems that will become obsolete over time. In a sense, NextGen will be like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. When we finish the north end, it'll be time to come back around to the south end and begin again. So we should prepare a foundation with this extended process in mind. We're going to be at this on a continuing basis. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't move with dispatch to begin to implement this capability. The AIA proposal that I've made allows us to begin now to do what I describe as build a little and test a little, layering and linking capabilities. It will help us to better define and prioritize the essential NextGen R&D for both the FAA and for our JPDO partner agencies. It will also provide critically important domain experience to key personnel in government and industry. We need this personal experience base to be able to execute this kind of a system. This domain experience in government industry is a requisite for the system engineering and integration required in such large-scale and complex programs. I recently chaired another National Research Council review, this one on the subject of system engineering, which clearly recognized the importance of strengthening system engineering skills to avoid the problems associated with the acquisition of large and complex systems that we've seen in DoD and other agencies. The good news here is that the FAA, in an effort led by Vicki Cox, has initiated a program to begin to enhance our system engineering education, a good first step, more yet required. Third point, AIA believes that the JPDA role as an honest broker with partner agencies can be enhanced by the recent FAA restructuring. As planning melds into implementation, the operating agency, with all the responsibility and at the end of the day all the accountability, will be the FAA. And JPDO participating agencies need to be engaged and ensured that their work will be closely integrated and aligned with key milestones and measured under a new structure. And we have two recommendations for metrics for success. The first is implementation of this incremental plan that I'm prepared to describe in more detail. The second is that FAA and industry, possibly through our Institute Management Council, develop NextGen measures of success and milestones. For NextGen, we believe the industry does have valuable process expertise as well as subject matter expertise to offer. We also note that recent developments in energy and its impact on NextGen can't be ignored. The consideration of NextGen benefits must be expanded beyond capacity improvements to include NextGen's energy and environmental benefits. AIA is encouraged at FAA's response in this arena as they have begun integrating modeling of energy and environmental consequences, such as fuel burn and noise, with the modeling of aircraft operations. We also have an idea for incentivizing early NextGen equipage. With the significant energy and environmental benefits of NextGen, we believe Congress should consider energy tax credits for early NextGen equipage. We do it for cars, home improvements, and appliances. Why not aviation, at least for early equipage? And finally, while FAA can speak more authoritatively about this, we believe the lack of an FAA budget will seriously hamper NextGen development and progress. And industry is on record as strongly endorsing the integration of NextGen with day-to-day air system operations and JPDO long-term planning. Because AIA members populate all of the working groups and co-chair 7 of our 9 groups, we are in a good position to evaluate FAA restructuring. Our members uniformly support this change, for it keeps the work plan where it belongs, closer to the implementing agency, and keeps longer-term planning within the visionary construct of JPDO.
Thank you, Mr. Kaminski, and we welcome additional information that you want to provide us. We'll put that for our review, and we will also be having more informal type roundtable discussions to follow up. Dr. Waltz, you're next.
Chairman Gordon and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to comment on the status of NextGen with regard to impacts on the environment. I'm the head of the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics at MIT and director of the Partnership for Air Transportation, Noise, and Emissions Reduction, also known as PARTNER. I'd like to note that I've also provided a more detailed written statement. Partners in FAA, NASA, Transport Canada funded Center of Excellence. We focus on energy, aviation, and the environment. We have more than 50 graduate students working with faculty members at a dozen universities. More than 50 U.S. and international organizations collaborate with us and are represented on our advisory board. In 2004, we wrote a report to Congress on aviation and the environment on behalf of the Secretary of Transportation and the Administrator of NASA. The report put forward a national vision for aviation and the environment that specifies absolute reductions in significant health and welfare impacts from aviation noise and air quality, and reduced uncertainty in understanding other emissions or other impacts such as climate. Since 2004, when we wrote the report, the challenges facing us have grown more significant. Aircraft noise affects 5 million people in the United States. It's the single greatest barrier to adding new runways and expanding airport operations. And through the constraints it places on the growth of our air transportation system, it produces significant negative impacts on our national economy. Further, we spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a Band-Aid approach of soundproofing homes around airports rather than investing in the technology which is the only long-term solution. In terms of air quality, aircraft are responsible for less than 1% of health impacts associated with poor air quality in the United States as a whole. Yet these impacts are still very important, 1 to 200, perhaps more, premature deaths each year. In regards to climate change, most estimates suggest that per unit of fuel burned, the impact of aircraft on climate is more significant than that impact from land-based sources. Climate is also an area where there's a vigorous international debate, for example, around EU plans to include international aviation in an emissions trading program. Unfortunately, this is also an area where the United States most significantly lags our European colleagues. Our entire portfolio of research is likely less than $1 million per year. This for the most uncertain and potentially most damaging environmental impact of aviation. In terms of jointly addressing the challenges of noise, air quality, and climate change, and achieving absolute reductions in impacts at the same time the system is growing, history provides a lesson. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we had a 95% reduction in the number of people impacted by aircraft noise. At the same time, we had a 6-fold increase in passenger miles traveled. And at that very same time, we had a 60% improvement in energy efficiency, more than any other mode of transport. All of those remarkable improvements came from technology that was derived from strong FAA, NASA, industry, university research programs. Today, further improvements are possible, improvements that can enable us to achieve absolute reductions while we grow. However, achieving these improvements is dependent on making the right decisions, and that requires a healthy scientific research program, and also on sufficient, sustained investments in the development of new technologies, next-gen operations, and alternative fuels. So what has changed since we wrote the 2004 report to Congress on aviation and environment? The most important change is that the challenges we are facing have gotten even more significant. In particular, if we were writing the report today, we would likely add contributions to climate change to the list of impacts we would seek to reduce in absolute terms, and there would be much greater focus on energy dependence. There have also been some successes in the last 4 years since we wrote the report to Congress. The FAA Office of Environment and Energy, headed by Carl Burleson, as Chief Scientist Dr. Lourdes Maurice, have led a sea change in the FAA. They have adopted a rigorous, science-based approach to understanding aviation's impacts and making policy decisions based on that. Under their leadership, with the participation of many others, I believe the Environmental Working Group of JPDO is regarded as one of the best. Today, the two most critical issues that we must address are, first, to accelerate the FAA-NASA Aviation Climate Change Research Initiative, and second, to significantly increase the focused technology, operations, and alternative fuels programs in NASA and FAA that are required to effectively bridge fundamental aeronautics research and industrial development programs. This is consistent with the pending FAA and NASA reauthorization bills, and I sincerely thank this committee for its efforts in that regard. It's the right thing to do for the health of the planet and for the health of the public. It's the right thing to do for the economy. The constraints on the system are sufficiently strong that they can impede realizing the potential of NextGen. If we do not achieve significant advances in environmental performance, there will be increasing impacts on health and welfare and increasing constraints on the national air transportation system with the negative economic impacts that come with both. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of this committee, for the opportunity to address you. I'll be pleased to respond to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Waltz. I am very sympathetic to your suggestions. This committee has tried to, in various capacities, authorize that R&D. It is very important to the country. We've got to get the funding to follow up, which means we need presidential leadership in helping in that regard. So at this point, I'm going to open up first round of questions. I'll be recognized for 5 minutes, and following up on that topic, let me just say that it's clear that all of you agree that it's important that NextGen be successful. And I think it is important that we have a president who is supportive, provides funding and leadership. We're going to have an election soon and a new president here in just a few months. And so we are trying to put together as a committee some recommendations for the next president, whomever that might be, in areas of our jurisdiction. So I'd like to take a quick couple of minutes here to get your recommendations on what we should then make to the next president in concerning NextGen. Why don't we start? Dr. Waltz, you want to start with yourself? Anyone else?
Certainly, we'll be pleased to. My primary recommendation would be to recognize that mobility and environment are both public goods, and right now they're standing in the way of one another, and a small amount of investment in the area of resolving these problems could have a major payoff. So I think it's an excellent area for us to invest in terms of advancing our scientific understanding as well as our ability to develop and advance the air transportation system.
Anyone else have any recommendations that you would like for us to include? Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about having the president or the new administration recognize that this is a very crucial issue for the nation in terms of the role that transportation plays, both in the global economy as well as domestically. And I think it's also important that the identification and confirmation process for the cabinet level as well as the FAA administrator be high on the list, because right now we're in a situation where there's that leadership is very important as champions for NextGen and transportation.
Hopefully that confirmation process will make that clear. Does anyone else like to? Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I think the important word here really is execution, for us to begin to get on with the implementation of this program, and the kind of foundation plan that I've put in the statement for the record, I think is a way to actually achieve this, to get on with the program and to also build the personnel skills that are going to be needed for this kind of key development, and that ought to be highlighted to an incoming president.
Scovel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There have been general comments. Let me highlight one specific observation for the committee's consideration, and that is keeping in mind your jurisdiction over NASA. As the committee well knows, NASA has reduced its funding for JPDO and NextGen, and has chosen to focus more on fundamental research than on its customary role in the past of not only research but also developing prototypes which it could hand up to the FAA when they were appropriately ready. Our office, in conjunction with the NASA IG, has undertaken a study of specific areas where NASA has made reductions in funding, has cut back to fundamental research. It may well be wise for this committee, if I may suggest, that you consider recommending to the President that NASA receive sufficient funding to not only conduct its fundamental research, but to bring prototypes to FAA so that NextGen can get that added boost.
We have put that in our authorization. Unfortunately, that we've seen across the board reductions in aeronautics research. Ms. Cox, you want to finish up on this one?
Yes, thank you. The FAA would also welcome the national attention and the focus on NextGen. We have quite a few plans underway, and we are, as you can see from my testimony, we have made some great progress that we would like to see continue. Our budget requests for '09 and beyond represent significant increases over past years, and we think that it's important to continue to support the program in a carefully aligned and consistent way, and so we would ask for that. Thank you.
Thank you. We are on a timeline, so let me just try to quickly get through one more question. I have a variety of other questions, particularly from Mrs. Cox, that I'm going to submit for the record, but let me just finish up here. Dr. Dillingham, as you pointed out, provisions were included in the House-passed FAA authorization bill to strengthen the JPDO by having its director report directly to the FAA administrator. In addition, in responding to a request for the record from the Aviation Subcommittee Chairman Costello on the extent to which moving JPDO out of the FAA's air traffic organization and how it would give the JPDO greater visibility and authority, GAO stated, and I quote GAO, that JPDO's dual reporting status hindered its ability to interact on an equal footing with ATO and the other partner agencies. GAO also said, and I quote, JPDO must counter the perception that it is a proxy for the ATO and as such is not able to act as an honest broker. And finally, GAO added that it's important for JPDO to have some independence from ATO. One change that could begin to address this issue would be to have the JPDO director report directly to the FAA administrator. And Dr. Dillingham, after the FAA's recent reorganization, the JPDO director has two ATO management layers above him before he can reach the administrator. Are you concerned that JPDO lacks sufficient independence from ATO as a result of this restructure? What would be the potential consequences of the lack of independence? And Mr. Scovel, from your perspective, what is the impact of FAA's reorganization on the NextGen development implementation effort? And can you elaborate on how you would characterize in your statement as friction between the JPDO and ATO?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You certainly got our words correct from the last time we talked. I guess our bottom line on this is the jury is still out in terms of how this new governance, new organizational structure is going to play with the external stakeholders. We, as you correctly said, we have said that we believe that a direct report to the administrator was the best arrangement. It was similar to what was in the House reauthorization. And part of the reason we said that is because if JPDO is going to be seen by the partner agencies as an objective, independent facilitator of multi-agency activities, then it seems to be important that they are on equal footing with some of the other parts of FAA and have a direct report that doesn't have to go through. When we talk to FAA about this, one of the concerns, and we've talked to Chairman Costello about the same thing, is that we didn't get the sense that the stakeholders had been allowed to comment on this, that it was more presented to them as a fait accompli. FAA has since told us that the internal stakeholders within FAA are supportive of this new arrangement, and we've suggested that they go and talk to the external stakeholders and see if they are feeling the same way. And I guess one of the big things, and something that you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, is when these major reorganizations take place, it seems that congressional consultation should be a part of that as well.
Chairman Costello is itching to follow up on this, and he will have his chance here in just a moment. Let me just, to be brief, and as you said, the jury is out on whether this is going to be successful. I would add to that the burden of proof is on the FAA to determine that this change of operation is successful when it's against most all the advice. I'd like to go further, but I can't. I now recognize Mr. Hall for 5 minutes.
If Mr. Costello has a problem with staying, I'll yield some of my time to you now to follow
I think his problem is sitting still in his seat.
Okay,
so we'll let you go.
Well, my first question would be to Mrs. Cox, and, you know, this is a time of year we go to hearing about CRs, and at the end of every session, CRs are pitched around. And I guess if the people, the voters ever really realize and understand what a CR is, that they're going to empty the capital of everybody, Republicans and Democrats up here, that yield to the use of CRs. CRs, to me, is simply saying, we're going to do next year what we did last year because we can't get together this year, and it narrows right down to that. But Ms. Cox, I wanted to ask you if FAA is funded through a continuing resolution for all of the FY09, what impact would it have on NextGen and the JPDO? You know what this year and what last year did.
Correct. Our interest is in maintaining a continuous funding stream for NextGen so that we can continue the plans that we have in place. We are concerned about a CR. A year-long CR is particularly concerning in terms of our ability to carry out our plans that we have laid for NextGen and the requirements. We are sufficiently aligned to make use of the funding in a prompt manner as it comes on board. A concern is, as I mentioned earlier, we have a rather large increase in our budget request for fiscal year 09 that we need to get this rolling. So the language around the CR will be important to us as we move forward.
Well, I thank you for that. I guess Mr. Dillingham or Mr. Scovel, how would you assess OMB's record up to this time of coordinating and aligning research budgets among the participating federal agencies, and how has OMB been effective if they have been effective? And a lot of times we question their effectiveness. A lot of times.
Mr. Hall, I think that in this case, the efforts have been noteworthy early on, because this is a multi-agency enterprise. The idea of working together and ensuring that resources that are aimed for NextGen are in fact considered as a portfolio in OMB's consideration, I think is a step forward that JPDO and FAA have been able to achieve. It's very hard to, or at least historically, it's been very difficult to sort of marshal cross-agency projects, particularly when you're talking about 5 or 6 different cabinet-level organizations.
Well, thank you. And Mr. Scovel. Yeah, Mr. Scovel.
Thank you, Mr. Hall.
Your opinion on that?
Yes, if I may, thank you. My statement, sir, speaks to disconnects between FAA and other agencies, which might well be remedied through greater OMB attention to FAA's NextGen effort. Specifically, I've mentioned earlier between FAA and NASA and the fundamental research question. Our statement also speaks to the disconnect between FAA and DOD and DHS on surveillance efforts, between FAA and DOD on next-centric operations efforts. And most tellingly, I think, and the clearest example of all of this is between FAA and the Department of Commerce, and specifically NOAA, on the weather capabilities question, the so-called 4D weather cube. There's a great difference between the budget request that Department of Commerce has submitted for NOAA to coordinate weather and what FAA, on the other hand, expects, and it requires some great attention and resolution at the OMB level.
I thank you for that. Dr. Waits, there's a lot of talk today about coal to liquid, a lot of questions and differences on drilling and when we drill and why don't we drill and all that. You suggest that aviation's impact on the climate might be reduced through the development of alternative jet fuels, I think such as coal to liquid. What other types of fuels are under study, and I guess more importantly than that, including production and distribution, will they produce substantially less carbon than the conventional petroleum-based fuels, and will they have a similar carbon footprint, and any estimates on cost compared to petroleum-based fuels?
You've identified all of the right issues. The production of fuels from alternative sources is something that we know how to do. Coal to liquid is only a good solution for the environment if we can find a way to sequester the CO2 as part of that, and that's a huge grand challenge.
We have more coal and more usable coal, I'm told, than any other nation in the world.
Understood. That tends to increase the production of CO2 rather than decrease it, going coal to liquid. I think the most promising things to look to are biosources, particularly those that do not compete with, food crops and things, because there can be some friction between the two. I expect that there'd be very limited amounts of resources for doing that to make significant changes, at least initially. But there's also a very healthy research enterprise that's looking at that topic, and it's one of the things that we have to pay a lot of attention to, because if we could solve that problem and really produce fuels from biosources that had no net CO2 impact, it would change the equation. So it's an important thing to pursue.
I think. Time's up, or I'd ask you about the cost estimates, but I'll get back to that.
You can submit any questions for the record, Mr. Hall. And the congressional leader concerning FutureGen is FutureGen and NextGen is Congressman Costello, Chairman Costello, and he's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I thank you for your kind words and your opening statement, and I thank Mr. Hall for offering to yield to me as well. We could get into a lot of issues here concerning NextGen, but we have limited time. Let me say that it's an important project. Everyone recognizes that, all of the stakeholders. This is a huge project for the FAA to handle. Frankly, we need to move from a radar-based system to satellite technology that will increase the safety and efficiency and environmental capacity of our air transport system. But I have to tell you, and I've said this at the T&I committee, I've said it in briefings, I've said it in roundtables, I've said it in meetings with Ms. Cox and many others from the FAA. I really question if the FAA has the capability and the capacity to manage a project of this magnitude. And I just want to say that for the record with members of the Science Committee. I want to clarify a point as well, and I think members should understand. I think members of the T&I committee, certainly the Aviation Subcommittee, understand the restructuring of how the acting administrator handled the restructuring of JT within the FAA. I still have questions as to if it is the most efficient way to go about and prioritize and to make NextGen a real priority within FAA. We held a number of hearings, a lot of meetings, a lot of roundtable discussions, not only with the FAA, but all of the stakeholders. The people who in the end will have to run the system, people in the end who will be affected by the system, the airlines, general aviation, many others, and we came up with what I thought was a very good bill in the H.R. 2881, which passed the committee unanimously, both subcommittee, full committee, and passed through the House of Representatives. And one of the things that we did in that bill was to elevate the head of the JPDO and to have that person report directly to the FAA administrator. And we did it not based upon what we thought was best, but based upon what all of the stakeholders thought was best, including, I don't want to speak for Dr. Dillingham and the IG, but others. With all of their input, we felt that if we're going to get this major project done, that the JPDO person had to report directly to the FAA administrator. Not only did that not happen, after the bill passed the House on September 20th of 2007, there was a restructuring within FAA that we found out about by reading it in the newspaper, as members of this committee did. We were not consulted, either the majority or the minority in the Aviation Subcommittee or the full committee. And when we had a meeting to determine why the FAA would move in this direction, which is contrary to what the stakeholders told us was the best system to move to, and what the will of the House was by voting for H.R. 2881, we were told that they thought internally that this was the best way to move forward. At that meeting, I must tell you, the head of the JPDO, who is sitting right here in the front row, Mr. Leader, I asked him the question. I said, were you consulted about this? You're ahead of the JPDO. And he said, no. No one talked to me about it. So I asked Mr. Krakowski, who is now the air traffic head of the air traffic organization, I said, you didn't consult with the head of JPDO to find out what their input would be, how it would affect them, what they thought? He said, no. And I said, why not? He said, because Mr. Leader was out of town. And I said, so how long was he out of town? And he said, for the last week. I asked Mr. Leader. He said, I was out of town for the last week. So I said, so you put all of this reorganization together in 5 working days? Well, no, they had been working on it for a few months. And it's one of the problems that we are facing, not only with NextGen, but with a number of other problems and issues within the FAA. They have a long record of not consulting with stakeholders, people who run the system, people who, in fact, are affected by the system. So I wanted to clarify that, and it's not a question for Ms. Cox. She is not the person who made those decisions, but I want to tell you that I think it was a major mistake the way that it was restructured. I believe that if, in fact, we're going to get this job done, to go to a satellite-based system, that the JPDO head should be reporting directly to the FAA administrator. I think all of the stakeholders would tell you that. They told us that, and that's the reason that we put it in the reauthorization bill. I am pleased on a positive note that, as Dr. Dillingham indicated, that for the longest time the FAA, they were moving forward putting NextGen together without consulting the air traffic controllers and others who in the end will have to run the system. It was a recommendation by, I think, Dr. Dillingham and General Scovel. It was a recommendation certainly of the subcommittee, and finally they are now consulting with some of the stakeholders. But I have to tell you that we have a lot of questions about where we go from here, questions about the agency's ability to undertake a project of this magnitude. You're talking about a project that the estimates run all the way up to $20–25 billion to implement between now and the year 2025. IG, back in April of this year, said to the FAA, you have long-term goals. We know where you are today. We know where you want to be in 2025. But what are your short-term goals? And give us some reports as to where we are today. Give us a gap analysis. Give us an interim architecture. And that was the IG's recommendations. I had a meeting yesterday, very briefly, with Ms. Cox, and she tells me that both the gap analysis and interim architecture should be done by the end of the year. But I have major concerns about how we are headed. I think that we have to provide very aggressive oversight, both this committee and the Aviation Subcommittee, in order to not only make certain that the project stays on track, but that we monitor it in a proper way, and not from the standpoint of on track, is it moving to the goal that we want to achieve, but also the cost. This project has been going on for many, many years, not only under this administration, but previous administrations. A lot of time and billions of dollars have been spent on this project, and we have very few results to show for it. So it is my hope that this full committee, as well as the T&I committee, will continue to provide aggressive oversight and to work with the FAA on NextGen. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I know I exceeded my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Costello. I certainly concur with you. And Dr. Gingrey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'll address my question to Ms. Cox. In your written testimony, you raised, I think, 2 very interesting points, and I'd like to explore those with the committee.
First, you testified that NextGen is not simply about air traffic capabilities, but also about fostering improvements in ground infrastructure, aircraft technologies, and most importantly, I think, alternative fuels. And then later on, you note that the airline industry sees about 40% of his overall cost spent on fuel. Maybe it's more than that now, growing all the time. And the FAA, of course, has taken a very active role in commercial aviation alternative fuels initiative, which is including testing on both coal to liquid fuels and gas to liquid fuels. Ranking Member Hall, of course, discussed that a little bit with Dr. Waits in regard to coal to liquid technology. And saying that, I find it troubling that this Congress, it seems, wishes to handcuff these efforts with a section in the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, which was passed last year. And I'm referencing, Ms. Cox, Section 526. I'm sure you're familiar with that section, but it explicitly prevents the federal government, any agency of the federal government, including, Dr. Waits, the Department of Defense, and within the Department of Defense, the United States Air Force, which is using most of the fuel in our air fleet. But this section prevents any agency of the federal government from contracting for the purchase of any alternative fuel that results in 1 scintilla increase in the carbon dioxide footprint. Dr. Waits has great concerns about that and seems to me in his testimony to be sympathetic with maybe the EU's approach to climate change and Kyoto Protocol and that sort of approach. It seems to me that that kind of policy is misguided, especially when we're in a time of great dependency on other countries for our fuel, and that it indeed would stymie the efforts of the FAA in undertaking with NextGen and developing alternative fuels. And so to that end, let me ask you 2 specific questions. First, because of these high fuel costs, can you provide the committee with the progress of testing of coal to liquid fuels within its role in NextGen? And the second question I have for you is this. Please answer this one yes or no, if you will. If the federal government is supposed to take the lead on alternative fuels, then isn't Section 526 of the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 a roadblock to innovation for NextGen? And if there's time remaining, I would like to ask maybe Dr. Waits to comment on that as well.
Thank you for the question. In terms of progress in alternative fuels, the FAA continues its investment in the program through the CAFE work that we're doing that Dr. Waits referenced. I would defer to his superior knowledge on the progress of testing in the coal to liquid fuels. I'm not an expert in that area, and I know that Dr. Waits is the expert in that area. We remain committed to finding an alternative fuel that does reduce the carbon footprint, and to that end, we've increased our investment overall in the environment with our R&D budget by a great deal between 2008 and 2009. Overall, our environmental investment has gone up 135%. And of the total R&D budget, our investment in the environment is a little over 10% of our entire R&D budget, which this committee is very familiar with. So we remain committed to, and we're encouraged by the progress that's being made. And in fact, we think that 526 sets a bar that we probably need to meet in terms of carbon dioxide. But I defer to.
Well, let me just say this. I know my time is limited. Maybe we won't get back to Dr. Waits, and maybe we can in a second round. But when you tell the agency of the federal government, particularly the Department of Defense, that don't bother to contract for any alternative fuels other than conventional bubble-up petroleum, jet fuel, that they are not going to be able to use it. So that certainly puts a damper on their enthusiasm for conducting the research on things like coal to liquid, carbon sequestration, as Dr. Waite said. That's the very research that we're trying to do within NASA and the Department of Defense, and it's just counterproductive. So I see my time's expired, Mr. Chairman. Maybe I'll have some time in the second round.
Thank you, Dr. Gingrey. I do have some good news for you. In that same act that you pointed out, this committee put in that energy bill an extensive program on carbon capture and sequestration, which is the basis for any type of coal to liquid or anything else, as Dr. Walsh pointed out. So the first step is being taken. You can't do it the second until you get the carbon sequestration. This committee played a big role in that program. Ms. Edwards, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Kaminski, in your testimony, you advocated securing systems acquisition, systems engineering, and integrated management talent at FAA and other agencies as part of accelerating NextGen. And so I'm really curious, given today's competitive environment, competing needs at other agencies, what you think the FAA can do to distinguish itself, and particularly looking at, and then to Ms. Cox, looking at the budget allocations for projections for the current fiscal year and the out years, a doubling and then a tripling of the budget for NextGen, and what the plans really are within the FAA to be able to both acquire the talent in-house that it needs to oversee this kind of project, and where the plans might be, particularly Dr. Kaminski, for reaching that kind of talent, given the competition from other agencies and even in the private sector.
It's a very good and important question, and when we look at the funding that the country is going to spend for this program over a 20-year period, my estimate would be something approaching $100 billion. When we start to look at all of our equipage issues, including the private sector investments that will be made in a corresponding way. So this is a big deal. This is a big and important and large, complicated program. And to get to your question to training the people, what I proposed in the briefing that I submitted for the record is an approach that involves building a little, testing a little, developing modeling and simulation tools to be able to predict how this system will work. Those are going to be a very important foundation for us to have as we look at new capabilities over time. We also have the problem of what I would describe changing the tire on the car that's going 60 miles an hour, because we're going to have to implement these improvements as we're moving along. Having modeling and simulation that we've validated by demonstrations is going to be very critical for us to be able to do that. The modeling and simulation and the demonstrations that I propose also are a superb training ground for people to gain some domain experience in what's going on. Education is required, but domain experience is also required in this process. So it's going to be very important for us to build that base. I do not believe that entire base is present today at the FAA. I think the FAA is planning to try to build that base, but it will be a challenge. And then to your last question, what are the incentives to attract people to this kind of activity? I don't believe they're only going to be financial incentives. In my experience in the DoD, what I have found is that it is possible to attract best and brightest people to government and to industry in this kind of activity, but keeping them depends upon providing them with real challenges, providing them with the tools to address those challenges, and most importantly, allowing them to see that they can make a difference, that they can change the world, they can change the infrastructure of our country in important ways. That's the fundamental attractor.
Well, it certainly has to be interesting work. And then, Ms. Cox, can you address the budget concerns? Because I think that kind of growth is really significant, and I'm not really sure what you have in-house to manage that kind of growth.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It is a very good one. In response to the systems engineering issue, I can say that we are growing some of that talent in-house. 57 employees in the air traffic organization have received certificates in graduate systems engineering disciplines, and we have 60 employees who are currently enrolled in certificate programs in systems engineering. So we gain some in that way. We're concerned about systems engineering and other technical skills, such as information technology specialists automation specialists that we will need going forward to support the level of work that you point out that we have. We have hired within the NextGen and Operations Planning Organization over the past year 78 new employees, most of whom came from outside the FAA. One way we attract people is, as Dr. Kaminski has pointed out, this is a very exciting program. This is a real opportunity to make a difference, and I think that's very attractive to folks, especially recent graduates just entering the workplace, and that is a group that we do want to attract. We believe that we're going to need to hire on the level of 300 more in-house professionals, in addition to the assistance that we can get through external sources, such as fairly funded research and development corporations and other external opportunities to bring people on board. And we are working closely with our human resources organization to be sure that they have the resources on hand to help us recruit and bring in those people. And as Dr. Kaminski points out, the methods to retain the people once we get them.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards and Ms. Cox. Dr. Ellers, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I've spent entirely too much time with some of you in the past 2 days, but I enjoyed it. Ms. Cox, continuing some of this discussion, I voiced yesterday in one of the 2 meetings we had my concern about NASA involvement and that they don't seem to have the funding or the personnel to do it. Now, you're taking on more and greater research and development responsibilities as a result, aren't you, in the FAA? And your last comment about the number of people you're adding, is that to fill that gap? Is it specifically directed to what NASA might ordinarily have done? Or are there other factors here as well? And also wondering if you have the flexibility you need to do the hiring. I know how convoluted hiring practices can become in the federal government. Obviously, you need these people fairly quickly. And I'm wondering if you're having any difficulties of that and whether you'll be able to find the mix of skills that you need in the time that you need them. Could you just give me some idea on that?
Well, as we pointed out, we do need people to help us manage the work that the budget request reflects that we will need to be doing to achieve NextGen. So the hiring is around that, and that includes the additional R&D work that we anticipate doing to support NextGen. We have been working closely with the Human Resources organization at the FAA to address this issue of the difficulty of bringing people on board. We had pretty good success, 78 people in just our organization in the course of a year, most of them coming from outside, is a pretty good record for the federal government in hiring. The FAA, as you know, has some flexibilities in that area that we are looking at how to utilize and take best advantage of. I'm not sure that we've always taken best advantage of those efforts in the past, but we're looking at that we have lots of room for innovation and moving ahead, so we hope to do that.
Well, if I lose my election, I may be applying as well. Also, the gap analysis that you mentioned, you stated that JPDO has completed a gap analysis. Could you expand just a little bit on the findings? What areas need focus? How will you handle it? How will the partner agencies handle it? Just if you can give me sort of an overall picture of what the gap analysis revealed and how you're going to handle it.
Well, the gap analysis was an effort by the Joint Planning and Development Office, and they worked closely with MITRE to assess what was in the integrated work plan and what's in the plans of the partner agencies of JPDO. They found 7 critical areas that they believe require additional focus. Those include the environment, and we've had quite a bit of conversation about those issues today. Security risk management is another area. Validation and verification of complex systems. You know, we're introducing something kind of new and different with this, and it's a very complex undertaking. Validation and verification of what we're doing is going to be extremely important. Then they looked at some air traffic issues that go to kind of specific areas. One is closely spaced parallel runways. 10 of the 35 OEP airports have closely spaced parallel runways, and we need to get greater capacity out of those. So that was another key area that they identified. How to integrate arrival and departure traffic with surface traffic. It was another area that they identified. And also this issue of air-to-ground functional allocation. What is the role of the pilot? What is the role of the controller in the NextGen environment? That needs more work to be addressed, particularly with the human factors issues that are involved with that. And finally, the JPDO, or the NextGen enterprise architecture, the enterprise architecture that rolls up the work of all the individual partner agencies into a single architecture for NextGen. The validation of that and developing a business case around that was another issue. Obviously, the air traffic issues fall under the province of the FAA and NASA in terms of some of those that require some research and development to move us forward. DHS with security risk management, and the JPDO with the enterprise architecture issue.
Thank you, Ms. Cox. And,
May I just make a comment?
okay, we're going. Yes.
I just want to say I've been very, very concerned about the entire NextGen project, and I wasn't sure that you and we were going to be able to pull it off in a timely fashion at a reasonable cost. I must say I'm pleased with the progress made, and I'm starting to feel much better about the project now, and I'm addressing that not just to Ms. Cox, but to all of you. I think you're making substantial progress in the right direction. I still have a lot of concerns, but it'd be crazy if I didn't have concerns about a project of this magnitude. But thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Dr. Ellers. You know, there's been a lot of discussion about costs, so I think it's appropriate that we talk to an appropriator here. And so, Mr. Rothman, let me just say, again, there's a 9/11 memorial getting ready to start, and so Mr. Rothman will be our last witness. Our last member to ask questions. Any other members that have questions, they can be submitted for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this very important hearing. I want to, I'm speaking quickly, I have 5 minutes. I want to acknowledge and express my appreciation to the panel for their expertise and for their service to our country. You have distinguished careers, each and every one of you. I want to say a couple things real fast. It was noted that air traffic controllers are being a part of the NextGen, and that's a great thing. Please keep that up. If there, in fact, is a need for more input from safety technicians, I hope the people responsible will address that. I also would hope that citizens groups who are involved in quality of life issues and noise in particular, but also emissions over their homes and their barbecue grills will also be consulted as NextGen is developed. One other pet peeve, wondering why small trainer propeller planes are still permitted to fly over densely crowded, populated areas. I don't think we're allowed to bring horses and buggies into through tunnels and bridges into the major densely populated areas of the country. So I think these trainers and small prop planes should be prohibited from flying over densely populated areas. So I hope that those who have jurisdiction over that area will address it. But here's the point or the question I want you the panel to consider. I'd like to hear first from Dr. Waltz, but I'm interested in everyone's views, assuming there's time. And I'm very grateful that you're working on noise issues and emissions issue. It's really important. And as Dr. Waltz said, that is a limiting factor on expansion of airports. But beyond that, it has to do with the lives of 5 million people, and I think that number is rather low. So thank you. Keep that up, and I will be paying attention. But let's assume that we make a quiet airplane, perfectly silent, and God willing that will happen someday. How do we feel about the sky over our head being filled with aircraft? You know those pictures of World War II, the bombing of Dresden, and the sky filled with aircraft. Now, granted, I understand that the effort is to have the planes fly higher and so all of that, but let's reduce it to the extreme, or the absurd, if you will, just to find out the nature of your thinking. Do we want a society or a world where our skies are completely filled with aircraft, even if they're silent and there's no dangerous emissions coming from them? Dr. Waltz.
Oh, I remember the first airplane my dad bought me when I was 4, so you're asking the wrong person. It was blue with yellow wings. I look up every time I see one. I think it's just an important part of providing, goods and services and movement of people. And the sky is not so filled with airplanes when you look at how much sky there is.
Where do you live, Dr. Waltz?
I live in Boston. Yeah. So no, my feeling is that, airplanes are an important part of our modern life, and I value them.
Anyone else have any comments?
Mr. Rothman, I think that there is a recognition of the concern about a situation that you described, and to address that, there's also initiatives or thinking about an intermodal approach to transportation. So your concerns are widely shared, and there are efforts about to do something about them.
Great. I just could say that there will be resistance to filling the sky with planes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rothman. Although Mr. Hall wanted me to point out that in Texas you can bring horses and buggies in on the roads and into the bridges. Again, thanks to our witnesses. I'm sorry we had to be somewhat abbreviated today. I know I have some, and I think other members will have some additional questions for you. And I'd like to now pass the gavel to Mr. Hall to adjourn us for this session of Congress. We're adjourned.